Hi, this is Paul. We're going to talk about this video because it was awesome.
Okay. And
Now, in case I've done both randos with Ross recently, it's on my channel, and one with Ethan recently, and it's on my channel. Ross's was about 2 hours, and Ethan's was about 3.5 hours. And the stuff that they covered, I'm only halfway through this video, and I'll probably only have time to get through the first half right now, and I'll listen to the second half tonight. But the stuff they covered in the first half of this video, I think, is super, super important.
we're live. Okay, so I want to just start with a brief little bit of context. Ross, I had watched you and Paul Vanderklay talk.
Now, Ross is a homeschooler, so it could. There's extra sound in this video in the background. It could be kids practicing their instruments and stuff like that. So, it's not coming from around you. It's coming from the video.
And then I had reached out to you on Substack, and you've talked to some other people that I know. And then we were just backstage, and you kind of told me how your life works. So I'm going to link the Paul Vanderklay video because that's helpful. And then you also recently had a conversation with Jordan Hall, and I watched that. So some of these questions are kind of coming out of both of these videos. So I'll link that, and if people are, curious and want to do the Ross Bird deep dive, we're going to give them all the information they could possibly want.
Yeah, nobody needs to do the Ross Bird deep dive, but Paul Vanderklay did.
Do the Ross Bird deep dive. Can you give us like the quick version of what you do in 9 months and what you do in 3 months, the rhythm of like the year of your life and et cetera?
Yeah. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to move from where I am now, which is in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is where I'm from, where my family lives for about 7 months out of every year. And I'm going to move down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which is 2.5 hours from here, down on Hatteras Island, which is kind of the least commercialized, still kind of romantic dirt roads part of the East Coast. And that's where we run our surf camp for 3 months. And then we'll be down there for another 2 months. We've just become more integrated in that community as well. And so we've tried to extend our stay there beyond when we're working our butts off for, 5 a.m. to midnight every day. We stay for September and October, which is a really nice time of year to be there. We can do that because our family homeschools our kids. And so we'll be there from mid-May to probably the end of October. Then we'll move back to Virginia Beach, where we're from, where our kids are kind of anchored in both. Well, I guess now they're more anchored in both places. So those are the two places we live. In Virginia Beach, I help to run Virginia Beach Fellows, the teaching director there, and have a number of other kind of unofficial ministry things going on, but also homeschool my kids and run my small business in what little bit of work there is to do in the off season to get ready for surf camp again the next summer.
Okay, so I want to jump straight into a text message I received from Luke Freeman this morning. I said, I'm talking to Ross Bird. What do you got? And he says, I guess the thing I've been mulling over is how we carve out more space for the commons. Is it simply expanding the scope of activities of the church? But as mainline churches are dissolving, and evangelical megachurches are filling the space, it is hard to see Ross's vision for the commons being provided by American churches. Does Ross see his vision for the parish church creating a generative commons? Where are seeds of hope for fostering the commons?
Man, knockout question from Luke.
Knockout question. If you were, pausing to listen to something that your spouse was telling you while you were washing the dishes, while you were listening to that, go back and listen to that question again. This might be one of the most important conversations I've heard ever since I've been making videos on the internet.
Thank you, Luke. I don't know. I really don't know. That doesn't mean it's not worth talking about. I think I do see, I answer it in the affirmative. I do see, at least I really try hard not to be an idealist about these things. And the thing I'm about to talk about doesn't really exist in the way that I'm about to talk about it. So that's just my big caveat, is like,
Now, you probably heard a couple elements in there that are super important, and they've been floating around sort of at the periphery of the consciousness of a lot of what we've been doing. And about Jordan Hall is about the only ones who's sort of really focused in on the commons. If, for example, you go to a place like Boston and you look at and you find Park Street Church is on the Boston Common. Part of the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern period was the enclosure of the commons. That there were spaces that anyone in the village could use. They used them collectively, they used them together. And it was up to the village to take care of the commons because everybody needed that commons. We have certain elements of the commons today. Oceans are commons to a fair degree. Nation states have sort of walled off periods around the oceans where they might restrict fishing and things like that. But, you know, questions about overfishing, these are questions of the commons. Now, also the parish. Part of what's been lurking behind so many conversations is this mythological village that we imagine, with the church at the center, with this special technology of a steeple that sort of connected the entire church from heaven to earth, right there in the church in the middle, and everyone in the village. Now, of course, what happens once, and interestingly enough, a lot of this, at least after the decline of the Roman Empire as such and its Christianization, what happens in Europe are villages, and then it's about at the time of the Reformation that cities really get going. And of course, cities are different from villages because there's not one steeple, there are many steeples, and there's not one sort of human network. There are overlapping, interconnected human networks. Now, of course, in the Roman Empire, in the period of the New Testament, we visit many large cities, those that you'll find addressed in the book of Acts and in the epistles in the New Testament. Cities like Corinth and Rome and Ephesus and Antioch. These are large cosmopolitan cities made up of different groups of people from different nations, and there's a lot going on there. But it's worthwhile to think about human beings in the context of the parish and with the concern of the commons.
you know, those who think talking about things that don't exist is not worth time and effort can log off now. But my answer to that is the parish model that I have in mind, I think used to do what I have in mind and can do it again. I'm not sure that it did it very well, even in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. And maybe that's part of the reason.
By then, it had already sort of come apart. Part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Reformation gets going in cities, and some of its big experiments happen in cities. Cities in Switzerland, for example, like Geneva and Zurich, with Zwingli and Calvin. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church had been working in cities for a very long time. And so we have to be a little bit careful with our mythologies here because we're dealing with ideals, which is very much appropriate. And part of how we find ourselves here is in the meaning crisis. Meaning crisis in some way is provoked by a whole stack of elements, one of which is, of course, the connection between heaven and earth, which the village maintains through the steeple and the church at its center, the relations between each other, this organic network of family and extended family and cousins, and then always some strangers, that the village has, but everyone is sort of known, and so it's a small model. And a big part of many of the collapses that we have been experiencing is because of these things. And I just yesterday had someone write me, a woman that was quite upset by what she heard Jordan Hall say in a particular video, and she asked if I would listen to it. And I did listen to it, and I responded to her, and I basically said I don't think I relieved her that she probably wasn't hearing him right, because if you want to understand Jordan Hall and his narrative, Ross and Jordan are on a similar page here, because what Jordan Hall was looking for was a village in order to live within. That's really what he was looking for. And even though the village that he's living in doesn't just have one spire, it is not just one thing in some isolated place in Western Europe, Jordan Hall has, at least to this point, come to sufficient satisfaction about the village character and the parish character that he is living. Now a parish is, when you say that word, it's sort of a churchy word, and you sort of imagine the relationship between that church at the center of the village, the priest or the minister in that church, and the rest of the village, and how this creates habitable order for everyone.
Reason why it has mostly died, because I'm speaking of kind of a mainline model of church where you have parishes, meaning neighborhood churches, that are not disconnected in the way that we sort of see non-denom world doing things now, where
Okay, now he mentioned mainline. Now this is, mainline Protestantism was in effect the shadow state church of the United States. And this was a cluster of churches, sort of a hierarchy. The Episcopalians were on top, and then the Presbyterians, and then the Methodists, and then the Baptists. And these were major churches in the United States that held a significant amount of the American population. And they were mainline because, you can listen to Aaron Wren talk about this, because these churches were physically located on the main line trolley tracks for the city. Okay? And so while this wasn't a village, they were at the center, and while there was differentiation and differences between these churches, together they sort of knit themselves together as something analogous to what the Catholic Church might be in a Catholic nation, or the Orthodox Church might be in an Orthodox nation, but different because, unlike the Catholic Church and the Orthodox, where you had a bishop that was, let's say, on par, if not more important than the mayor, because part of what happened, obviously, in Catholic and Orthodox countries was that often the king and the state would get their fingers into the church situation because they saw the church as a way to carry the state's water or do the state's bidding. Now, that was a reciprocal arrangement and relationship for a very long time in Latin Catholic Europe and in Orthodox countries, because it was often the case that the bishop and the pope and the metropolitan, just look at the name, they would often get the state to do things for the church. And one way to understand the long history of Latin Christendom in Europe is both groups going back and forth with respect to both fighting for power between the state and the church, and fighting for supremacy. Again, I'm almost done with the Vatican I book, and that book is all about the fighting between these very high monarchs in Europe, and then constitutional monarchs and parliaments, and of course, for the Roman Catholic Church prior to Vatican II, democracy, well, that was just plain, in many cases, evil and Protestant, especially after Vatican I with the Ultramontanism. In America, things were different. There was no state church. And so the state and the church had sort of a hands-off relationship where they could sort of move together and collaborate at times, and they would fight at times, but it was never in the direct way that it was happening in Europe and in the old world because of these state churches and because of the particular history of Christianity and the collapse of the Roman Empire and the supplanting, at least especially in the West, of the emperors with, let's say, the bishops and the papacy. Really the bishops, because when the Roman Empire, when the civil regime would collapse, the bishops would step in and solidify the order, and that's where, in many ways, the lines between, let's say, secular and ecclesiastical authority would get very interwoven. And this has been a long, long history in Europe. And so part of what happens in the great experiment in the United States is that these things are different. But yet, early colonies had state churches. And then after the development of the United States and the Constitution, bit by bit, slowly, Massachusetts was the last to give up their state church because, of course, it's the United States. You had all these different states, but then there was the nation. Of course, if you know anything about American history, you had the this first attempt at figuring out a confederation of states. That didn't go, and then the American Constitution comes later, and that seems to work better. And the separation of church and state was really important because it was sort of a dance that the church and the state did culturally to work out how the country would go. Because the church basically had a moral authority, but no, it didn't have the power. See, this is classic Protestantism. It didn't have the power of the sword. The state had the power of the sword. And so instead, as in Europe, sometimes the Pope getting the state, getting the emperor to do his bidding, or the bishop getting the emperor, the metropolitan getting the emperor to do their bidding. You know, look at the Crusades in that, in terms of relationship between them. And in almost every case, the relationship between state power of the sword and ecclesiastical power was very complex and often intermingled. In the American case, because, again, of the particular nature of democracy, churches had influence and power to the degree that people voluntarily listened to them. Because, again, in America, with the separation of church and state, churches are voluntary organizations. And if your church annoys you or angers you or you disagree with something of your church, you go to another church. You don't go to any church. But pastors still were listened to. Churches still were listened to. And so the relationship between state power and church power was very different and very interesting. But that separation was key. And the mainline churches, up until really the 1960s, when the counterculture takes hold in the 1970s, the mainline churches have been in free fall. And while you can hear, and while we have heard, ever since especially the George W. Bush administration and Karl Rove's strategy of bringing George W. Bush into office by sort of fashioning him as an evangelical president, because Karl Rove did the math and realized, oh, you can get a lot of votes by sort of pandering to the evangelical crowd, something that Donald Trump has certainly known. The main line, and in many ways, in many cases, the Democratic Party themselves have been in lockstep. And this is part of the reason that part of the main line, if you think about the triumph of churches, the triumph of the American main line really comes to be through the Roosevelts, Eleanor Roosevelt particularly, and her vision of the world. And this has, the main line sort of becomes the blue church, where people don't necessarily go to church or listen to a pastor. And I've read some Substacks. There's a main line Christian out there writing Substacks who's basically been noting this, how a lot of mainline people don't go to church because fundamentally the forum of their religious application is political, not ecclesiastical. In other words, it's more important how you vote than how you pray. Now, Ross's, but as with many things, the main line is way more complex than this sort of stereotype or even straw man. And within the main line, there have been many devoted people who, in terms of how they believe and how they act, they're often seen as more evangelical, but they're still within the main line. Now, part of what happened in the neo-evangelical movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s is that certain issues would come to the main line. And when the main line, for example, would adopt women in ecclesiastical leadership, or much more recently, when the main line would adopt affirmation of same-sex marriage, you'd have conservative split-offs starting their own denomination. This is a very old thing. The Christian Reformed Church itself is heirs to a split-off that happened in the Netherlands, and then they split here too, over certain issues historically. So that's a regular pattern. And if you listen to my conversation with Ross, you'll hear how at heart he feels mainline, but he's also an evangelical. And so this has been part of it. Now, where this gets really interesting is that Ethan Caughey is, I would say, much more followed the emerging church track. Who's the emerging church? The emerging church were evangelicals, people raised evangelical, who over time, politically and socially and in a number of other metrics, began to sort of slide over towards mainline-ish ideas. And you can see this in the Christian Reformed Church and the split that's currently going on in the Christian Reformed Church. The people who are leaving the Christian Reformed Church, generally speaking, churches split right and leak left. And so if people are in a conservative evangelical church and they don't like the politics of many of the people around them, they might find their way out and maybe go to a mainline church. That's usually been a much smaller seepage. The Christian Reformed Church is a little bit different because we're actually, it remains to be seen if this leftward exile will be a leak or a split. But what happens in the emerging church movement is that a great person to look at, she's no longer alive, is Rachel Held Evans. She wrote books. Her father was a professor at an evangelical/fundamentalist university in Tennessee, where they had the Scopes monkey trial, and she had the internet, and her politics were much more liberated, and she believed in women in ecclesiastical office, and she wasn't doubting evolution. And she wrote I don't know if she signed her book to me, because I was a blogger then, and she sent me her book, and I read her book and reviewed her book for a blog that was at that point run by the denomination. And she eventually winds up in the mainline church. What happened in the emerging church movement is that many, many people sort of deconstructed and left church altogether. Some of them went over to the main line, but many didn't actually find their way all the way back into church. Many, along with many in the main line, just sort of looked at church and said, what's the point? Really, what's the point? It's way more important how I vote than how I pray.
You have your pastor of, New Life Church here, or, so-and-so Bible church there, but churches that are connected to one another through, let's say, a common authority. Bishops would be the older word for that. And yet they are mostly governing in that sense I was talking to Jordan Hall about, in a hyper localized way, where they pretty much, their job is to know their village. Their job is to know their neighborhood. And then from there to do very little in the way of, I guess, what we would think of as church programs now. Mostly they're there to just be a center for prayer and worship, for the sacraments.
Okay, now, because of the theological matrix of especially fundamentalist and neo-evangelical churches, most of their church programming tended to be catechesis, we can use the old word, or learning about the Bible, Bible study, lots and lots and lots of Bible study, Bible memorization, and then helping people, and then often sort of Christian alternatives to secular things. Boy Scouts started out as a mainline church movement. YMCA started out as a mainline church movement to give young boys and young men good things to do and stay out of trouble. What happens in the fundamentalist and neo-evangelical movement is that they start doing alternatives to that. Assemblies of God had Royal Rangers, Christian Reformed Church had Calvinist cadets. You can still hear Freddie sing the theme song every now and then on the Freddie and Paul show. But they're sort of hiving themselves off, and most church programming is focusing on sometimes the needs of the poor, because that pretty much all Christians share alike, the needs of the poor, but then also Christian formation and instruction and alternatives to worldly amusements, because there was a sense in many of these churches that the outside world is getting worse and worse. There are eschatological reasons for that, particularly in some churches like dispensational churches, but we're going to sort of put up walls and live within the church here. And we're going to come out from the people and we're going to live within the church, and the church program is going to do this. Mainline programming, part of what happens in theology is you have something called the social gospel. And mainline churches more often would get into this. They'd have, again, evangelical churches would have their care for the poor. Mainline would tend to be a little bit more structural, a little bit more organizational. And because they were larger, wealthier, they had quite a bit of programming around this. They would have programming like Bible studies and that, but the emphasis between them, between those two groups, was quite different. Evangelicals and fundamentalists would do a lot of Bible teaching and work for the poor. Mainline would do, especially as these two groups sort of continue to split, way more social gospel type work, but also some Bible study and such. A lot of what's been happening over the last 30, 40 years is that megachurches managed to have huge program bases. And what was really interesting about this is Ross sort of said it, and I thought, oh yeah. In many ways, the megachurches are becoming the new mainline by virtue of their size and their reach and what they're able to do, but the dynamics are completely different. In terms of socially, this is where you get into Aaron Renn's positive, neutral, and negative world. And of course, because the mainline churches are just basically crumbling and sort of disappearing. Now, every time I say that, someone out there is going to a vibrant mainline church that they love, and it's doing really well. Praise God. I'm happy for your church. But overall, the mainline has been disappearing like a block of ice in a hot Sacramento sun in America. Some of them have gone to evangelical churches, but many have deconstructed. Now, some of the loss of evangelical churches has come from people who have deconstructed. And so this is a very interesting conversation between Ross, who is very solid evangelical, goes to an evangelical non-denominational megachurch. Is he non-denominational? I'm not sure. So I'll have to check that. Ethan had been in a church like that and is sort of deconstructed and coming back around. So it's a super interesting conversation, even on that score.
For the ministry of the gospel in I guess the simplest imaginable sense. Hopefully with open doors, let's say, where you don't lock the doors of the church, and the priest's job is mostly to just be there to pray with people. And so I think from there, if you can...
Okay, what he said right there. There's an image of... Now, you'll notice that if you're in a big city or someplace, the main line, Redeemed Zoomer, for example, noticing the beautiful buildings of the main line, and the Catholics would have cathedral-like buildings. Now, a cathedral is the chair, it's the seat of the bishop. But again, the church-state relationships are very different. But their churches would be open, sort of like a tourist thing. And because people are walking down the street, oh my, look at that big, beautiful building. I want to go inside. Is it as beautiful inside as it is on the outside? Yes, it is. Go inside. And it's quiet, and there's a sense of awe, and people have religious experiences. But there's not a lot of programming going on there most of the time. You might have a service, and there might be some chapels in the wings, and there might be a confessional if it's that kind of church. And so now what Ross has basically sort of intimated is, let's imagine the parish. Let's imagine the village. Let's imagine the church at the center of the village with its steeple connecting heaven and earth. And the doors are open, and you walk in, and who will you find? You'll find a priest or a minister, and you can sit quietly and pray, or you can ask the priest to pray with you, or if it's time for the confession, they can hear your confession, or you can light a candle, drop some money in the little tin, etc., 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 etc. And what he notes is that the irony is that in many villages, maybe you can get into the church because you know the pastor and where he lives, etc., etc., etc. But what Ross is doing is sort of giving us a vision of this old system that connected individual people to the church, which was the connector of heaven and earth. But also all of them were connected with each other.
Reclaim that, or claim it anew, let's say. I don't want to go backwards necessarily. I think, yes, it becomes a seat for a new kind of economy. And I'll just give a couple of examples. One thing that I think is helpful to attach to this is something like a graveyard. So I said, the church's call in my thing that I'm imagining here, which is not mine, it's just taking notes from the way churches have done things for a very long time, is to do very simple ministry, which, like I said, has to do with prayer and the sacraments, but it also has to do with, let's say, weddings and funerals, with the very basic foundation blocks for how to deal with the human race, marrying them and dealing with their death. And graveyards is a good example of that, because if you were to reinstitute, and I say that because most of the churches that I see in my town don't have graveyards around them anymore, or they have graveyards that are no longer doing that role, let's say, for people that are still dying in their congregations. If you were to reinstitute something like that, then the church would immediately offer a kind of continuity with its people, where you are, not only providing the service of ministering to families and the dead, but you are also creating a framework in which every time you go to worship, you are walking past or even over top of the buried saints who worshiped with you or worshiped before you, and thinking about yourself being buried in that place, which immediately gives a kind of economic investment. If you want to use a...
Okay, so there's a few layers here. One of the things that happens is that with the cemetery around the church and this idyllic village with the steeple that connects heaven and earth, you can listen to the talk that I gave at the first German festival. I should dig that up, because the sermon that I gave connected a bunch of these things. You've also got the dead. So you're in community with the dead, because they're right there. And in many, if you go to old churches in Europe and in England, they're in the building. That's why they were the stinking rich, because if you were rich and wealthy and powerful, you could afford to be buried in the church. And not quite hermetically sealed. So as you're decomposing, when everyone is going in there for mass, the rich stink. But again, now this is the connection. And what Ross is talking about is not just, again, the religious element of your life. And this is where, again, Tom Holland's thesis about modernity and the discovery of religion and the label of religion is important, because the point that I've made often, religion is not this thing that you do over here on the side of your life, which maybe you do or don't do. Your religion is your basic operating system for deciding what is highest and pursuing it. That's your religion. And that's why the Greeks, even though were they religious, they would say, no, we're not religious. You look at the temples and the sacrifices, and you doggone are religious. You just sacrificed your daughter for fair winds to get over to Troy to get them. Yeah, but that's how you manage the gods. Oh, and that's not religion. Oh, well, we don't have gods to manage. Oh, and that's not religion? It's just a different answer to the same type of question.
Vulgar term for it there, but it gives you continuity with something that has become sort of gnostically detached from the rest of our everyday life. So that would just be one example. Weddings, I think, would be another, and I think you could sort of do the same thing with weddings, at least.
Because, of course, in weddings in a village, what happens with weddings is you're knitting the family together. Now, my closest experience to village life is in Whitensville, Massachusetts. It was a small town, which is increasingly just integrated into the Boston metroplex that grows and grows, even though it's an hour away from Boston. But immigrants often sort of village even in the middle of a city by virtue of their culture and their desire to sort of stick with their own religiously. And so, for example, in a place like Whitensville, Massachusetts, this was always weird about myself, because on one hand, on my mother's side of the family, I had endless relatives. And on my father's side, I had none. And we didn't figure that out until we figured out that on my father's side, we were from a small Jewish family that went to Western Michigan and tried to assimilate in with the rest of the Dutchmen there. But on my mother's side, we were a part of a wave of Frisian immigrants who came with the dairy cows for Mr. Whiten to restock the town of Whitensville with dairy again. And so within the Christian Reformed Church, eventually churches, they intermarried and intermarried and intermarried. And then when new Christian school teachers would come from other villages in the Christian Reformed network, they would come in and intermarry, and all of those other networks would be married between. And that's how the Christian Reformed Church became such a tight-knit family thing, because everyone was related to everyone else. It was a new kind of village spread out over the United States and Canada, and to a degree the Netherlands too.
At least in my community of evangelicals who go to any number of different non-denominational churches, the churches themselves are usually not, let's say, beautiful spaces to have weddings. And so it's assumed by the pastor and by everyone else, every young person that goes there, that when they have their wedding, they might ask the pastor to come to it, but it's going to be at some rented barn somewhere that isn't actually a barn. But
so already, see, weddings, funerals, they're detached from this strange technology that sits at the middle of the village that connects heaven and earth. And so the weddings and the marriages, they're all down here. They're not necessarily connected up. And you can understand part of what happened with fundamentalism and neo-evangelicalism is that they were part of that process too. The mainliners, in some ways, were still more connected with the religion of the old world. Their churches looked like the old world. The pragmatism and simplicity of lower church. And then the Jesus movement that was very anti-institutional. And it was against the man. And of course, the whole counterculture comes in the United States and stands against that. So you can see, as Ross talks about it, you can just smell whiffs of the old knitting.
Is a barn space to have a wedding, and no judgment
That's
to
where my
these
wedding
things.
is going to be.
No judgment to these things. And probably my kids would be too, because the spaces where we would do those things, just as the spaces where we bury people, are no longer, let's say, straightforwardly continuous with our worship.
Okay, so Luke's question to you, where he's talking about your conception of the parish, which you just kind of like beautifully laid out, and I'm going like, yeah, I'm all in. Let's talk some more about that. But where is that coming from? Because you and Luke had a conversation that hasn't been released yet. I'll get Luke's channel linked in here as well, so people can look for that.
I don't know if we recorded it.
Oh, it's
I
not
think
recorded.
It was just for fun. Yeah, I don't remember, but I don't think we recorded it.
Well, I'm going to link his channel anyways, just because he's got a great channel.
Agreed.
Have you written about this parish structure? Is this something that's just front of mind and you're spending energy moving towards? Give me more.
Yeah, there's an essay I wrote for Mere Orthodoxy about a year ago that's called A Parish Manifesto. Sort of tongue-in-cheek with the manifesto part. But it is that, really. It is that. It's saying, look, here's some... I love the non-denom world. I am in it to some degree, but I wasn't born in it. I was born, to kind of continue to answer your question, I was born in the Episcopal Church, raised in the Episcopal Church, still am deeply connected to the Episcopal Church in which I was born and raised. I even worked there as a lay minister for a few years. And even now, when I worship for part of the year in a non-denominational megachurch and for another part of the year in a very small village Methodist church, that is very low church as well, I'm still pretty much just an Episcopalian, or you might call an Anglican, because Episcopalians are sort of going extinct these days. But and so marrying those things together, that is kind of my goal and my dream in a sense, is that I am an evangelical and I'm not ashamed of, all the mega churches we go to, but I also see that they are unsustainable in some ways. That I think what I was just describing to you, things that the main line used to have, still has, but is not, let's say, stewarding very well, could evangelicals could have those things again. I mean, if you think about it, the evangelical revolution, in a sense, was a revolution of content at the expense of form. So the forms were all there. Like almost all of our great grandparents went to a somewhat traditional church in one sense or another. They sort of knew that it was going to be vaguely liturgical, even if they were sort of like low church Baptist. It's still pretty liturgical. I was just doing the funeral at my grandmother's low church Baptist church. She was 90 some years old a couple of months ago. And I was just struck by how traditional the service still was, even though you might think of Baptists as being, let's say, the least liturgical of the mainline world.
And everybody has a religion and everybody has a liturgy. It's just true, because you have to do things with patterns in order for people to feel okay with each other.
So anyway, I think what happened any number of years ago, and it happened across a couple centuries, if you want to, really go for it. But I would say it happened especially, let's say, in the Billy Graham days, was there were so many people that knew what kinds of forms the church had to offer. They just were like, where is the spirit to fill this body? It is nowhere. It's just like a bunch of empty rituals in so many churches across the country. We have the rituals, and yes, maybe they are beautiful, but they no longer feel very beautiful when it doesn't feel like people actually believe them anymore. And so a lot of the evangelical...
And that's such an important point, because that's what happened. And there's sort of when it comes to ritual, there's sort of like a herd immunity with ritual. It only works if there's a critical mass of people there who believe it. And if they don't believe it, it starts to feel empty and the ritual doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? It doesn't connect heaven and earth. The village doesn't light up and do the thing it's supposed to do. And there was now again, sometimes people at this moment will then, let's say, decry the Enlightenment. I think if you read Tom Holland's book Dominion, you'll recognize that there's actually a cycle of this. And you can track this cycle all the way to the Hebrew prophets. I desire obedience, not sacrifices. There it is. But then sacrifices come again. And so there's what happens in the Bible and in Christianity is you get this cycle of rituals gaining and losing their power and new rituals taking their place, and on we go. And of course, there's something to the old. And so the big calling card of let's say the Catholics and the Orthodox is we're still doing exactly what we did. But if you looked at the Jesus people and the Baptists and the Christian Reformed, we'd be like, no, I don't see all those funny clothes and hats and buildings in the Bible. I'm just reading the book of Acts, and we're reading the book of Acts and doing exactly what they said they're doing. Oh. And of course, the Anabaptists said that in a big way. And so on and on this goes in terms of this disenchantment and reenchantment of our practices and our patterns and our rituals.
Evangelical revolution was something like, Jesus's correction to the Pharisees, which is like your whitewashed tombs. You kind of got all this form, but where is the content of your heart? Where is your heart seated? Does it actually love God? Or you could say it's the same message from the prophets, where they would say, God would say, I don't even desire your sacrifices anymore. Sacrifices without love, I do not desire. And so sacrifices without love is where a lot of our churches went to some degree, not all of them, of course. And so we corrected that by saying, bring back the love. But when we did that, we sort of forgot the forms, a soul needs a body. And so when you want to have a kind of spiritual revival, it's very hard to do, but you need to remember that spirit must live in something. And so over time, I think we have let the form of our content go by the wayside and dissolve. And we've ourselves become somewhat accidentally Gnostic in our evangelical traditions. And what's weird is that this even goes for the traditions that have really remained, like the PCA church, which I would say is maybe the strongest kind of evangelical tradition, in that there's so many evangelicals that are there, and it's still sort of a traditional church. But even there, you can see that it takes on a kind of non-denom.
The Anglicans are trying. Let's be fair to the Anglicans in America. They're really trying, but it's really hard.
Form over time that, let's say, is not attached and continuous and embodied in the same way that my Episcopal church was growing up, or that most people's churches were 100 years ago. So.
Okay, so your title for this new is not as in brand new, but is parish?
Yeah. So the word parish, it just means neighborhood, from the Greek paroikos, and so that's what people used to call their church. You know how, like in English, there's sort of a confusion between when you say church, do you mean like your immediate local church, or do you mean like the body of Christ or whatever? So they would use the word parish so that everyone knew what they meant. They meant like their neighborhood church. And then the parish became a kind of governing structure in a sense, because you would know, okay, you have your parish priest, and then you would have bishops that oversee something like a diocese, would be a group of parishes that are bordering one another. And then the bishop would oversee, let's say, a group of bordering parishes. And then you could have higher levels than that, I guess, too, but also lower levels within the church, like deacons and lay leaders. So.
And do you feel like you're able to envision a world where non-denom churches bring back some of this older stuff and recreate themselves into a parish model rather than chasing kind of the endless growth of a mega church model.
Yeah, I do. I mean, that's what I'm proposing. You know, I'm not. It's not like I'm going to the dead mainline churches all over town and trying to revive it from there. I would like, though obviously they're welcome, and in the end, I'd probably like to be working with them because they have all the beautiful buildings that sometimes even have graveyards next to them. In my town, and probably in most towns in America, we're watching those churches get torn down and turned into supermarkets, or sit vacant or nearly vacant for years because nobody knows what to do with them. But what's crazy is that it's like if you wanted to treat this like some kind of revolution, it's like a revolution where the skeleton is already there. The churches are just everywhere. There's already neighborhood churches in like literally every place all over America because this thing, parishes, already existed. And so, you know, we went kind of hog wild with our evangelical movement, and we're like, we won't even have anything to do with those buildings. Oftentimes, we'll just like be in the storefront or the warehouse or the gymnasium or the movie theater or whatever. And I think we've maybe to some degree, a lot of the churches have matured past that phase where they build their own mega buildings, or maybe they take over a church like one of the ones that I'm talking about. In fact, I am at a satellite campus of our particular megachurch. It's like 6,000 people, but we bought a dying Presbyterian church for one of the satellite campuses, and that's where we worship. So it is like a traditional building, and about 300 of us is how big our satellite campuses are there. And yet, you know, the sermon is preached on a screen, you know, a big screen inside of this traditional church, and so it still has kind of a mixture of aesthetics. So yeah, my goal is mostly to preach to the evangelicals and say, hey, you know how we're running into that issue where mega churches are not doing all the things that we think the church should do as being big, but then even when you turn them into like satellite churches of a mega church, they still aren't quite doing the thing that you want to do. There's a reason for that. Let's talk.
Now let's also, once you sort of re-village or reimagine the village, you then have the question, what belongs in the church and what belongs adjacent to the church? This is an old question that Protestants have been wrestling with. For example, in my denomination, we had this idea from, boy, Matt and Phlebas are going to be so happy to hear me talking like this. They've been sitting by their computers for like 7 years saying, when is Vanderklay going to finally be Christian reformed? Well, Phlebas, Matt, your day has come. This idea of sphere sovereignty, where in the Christian Reformed Church, the ministers are right there in their churches. You know what they're not running? They're not running the Christian schools. They're not running the town. They're not running they're not running the trains. They're not running the post office. They're not running the DMV. They're not running any of that stuff. Why? You don't want the ministers running those things. You want the ministers in their churches, running the churches. So actually not running the churches. We have the council to do that. You want the ministers serving in the churches. But again, you get the vision here of, our culture needs to be revillaged. But the difficulty, of course, is, yeah, but the world is already so full of buildings and networks and people and things like that.
Talk about it. And so, yes, what I would like to see is a parish model.
Yeah, this interests me greatly because so I was working in ministry, working in churches till I was 25. And then I left church and eventually left faith and God and the whole shebang for like 8 years. And it was just a couple months ago where I had a profound spiritual experience that returned me to trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And
wow.
the resurrection of Jesus,
Praise
the anointed one, and living by the guidance of the Spirit of God. And most of my friends left megachurch land like me, and many of them have yet to.
The emergent That's the emerging church movement.
Return to church, but are like having kids and talking about coming back to church, because they're all like, I really appreciated growing up in church, but I got burnt out by the corporatism. And I got one friend that's like,
Industrial Christianity. Churches struggle with scale. Why? Because the village is, we are bound by time and space. That's sort of where the Dunbar number comes. How many people can you relate to? Well, how many hours are there in the day? Well, how many hours in the day do you need to put bread on the table? How many hours in the day do you need to do this? Do you need to do that? How many people do you actually have time to get to know personally, in real life, in full resolution? It's a limit. So the village, well, you can know everybody, and sort of scales out how well you know them. Family, neighbors, friends, strangers, sort of goes like this. But, how do we scale? Well, you scale with institutions, and the institutions get industrial.
I think I might just become a Catholic, because I need some ritual and some stability, and I don't know that I can find that from evangelical non-denom land.
Yeah, I get that.
To hear you talking about, there's a world where non-denom could, I don't know if fuse with mainline is the right term, but almost like maybe the evangelical movement is kind of at the end of a bungee rope jump, and it's time to like start returning and
The word is metagelical.
collecting some stuff into I don't know. I mean, I guess a better model or a better expression of faith in God.
Yeah, I like that image. I think it's really helpful. The way that I would describe that bungee rope is that going all the way down, it's been a movement of what I would call something like inclusion, or you could even just call it like evangelism, like reaching out, being open, come as you are. And I would say the rope going back would be something like holiness, where it's like the opposite of inclusion. Inclusion meaning
So holiness means set apart. So that's right. It's the tensions between heaven and earth. It's the tensions between hierarchy and equality. It's all of these tensions that we just keep bumping into. And of course, if you listen to Jordan Peterson's biblical series, what possibly is shaped like this? Can't figure it out. Sitting in a Protestant church, and wait a minute, the one symbol that remains, there it is, that doggone cross.
bringing in, and holiness meaning set apart. Both are absolutely necessary. You can't pit them against each other in the sense that choosing one or the other would make you truer. It's only true to do both. But there are times when, let's say you do one at the expense of the other, and then you have to correct. And I would say that we're finding ourselves in a moment like that, where we have been so come as you are that people don't even want to come as they are anymore. They'd rather hear Jordan Peterson tell them to get their act together. And then they'll say, like, I'll follow that guy, take me to the church that tells me to get my stuff together.
So I've had half a conversation with Martin Shaw, and those of you who have wait, don't tell me, no. Those of you who have no wait, no ads have seen, I had to take the video down and repost it, so your initial comments were lost. Sorry about that. But Martin Shaw and I get into this. We get into this directly because what's happening is that it's basically like in The Incredibles when Dash says, when everybody's special, nobody's special. And so people are waiting, young men are coming in waiting to show how special they are. And I'll put that clip right here.
We usually will be waiting. A catechumen has to announce themselves to us several times over. They effectively sit at the door of the church, and you go, well, what can you do for us? Not the other way around. And that's why so many young men are turning up. What can you do for us? Because they've waited their whole life to be asked that.
Yeah.
And they go, let me show you how beautiful I am.
Yeah.
Let me show you how diligent I will be. And it is a thing of beauty. These guys, they're glimpsing something. Something is about to happen. I'm not quite sure what is about to happen, but whatever the petri dish is that we've all been in for the last few decades is changing.
Yeah.
And one of the things I notice that people like, I would say that orthodoxy is effectively it's profoundly introverted. It's profoundly introverted. And because we live, I would say, in a very extroverted culture, a confessional culture, there is something about the deep interiorness of orthodoxy that I think people just find inexplicably attractive. And that's what we're dealing with in our little church.
Okay, here we are after the clip.
And that I'm gonna have to pick up my cross daily and follow him. Then I will stay there, even if they do weird religious things that 20 years ago you said, don't worry, we're not religious, we just love Jesus. People will even
Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. Well, yeah, religion's pervasive, and relationship is at the heart of it.
take those religious things on because they not only want to be included, they want to be included into something. They want to be included into a holy people.
It's been interesting looking at the parallels with marriage, because someone might say, we're not married, we have a relationship. And that has sort of gone through, and now people are like, yeah, but the institution administers the relationship. That's the way that the organic and the institutional relate. One structures and helps the other, because a la combinatorial explosiveness, if you just say, my wife and I have a relationship. Well, what does this relationship include? How does this relationship bind? And the truth is that you absorbed all sorts of assumptions from your parents about that relationship. I should note a really wonderful Substack. Ben Gressick has been Substacking about CRC stuff. Woohoo! And he wrote he's written a series of really interesting Substacks. I'll put a link to his things and stuff, a link to his Substack below, because one of the things that he's been talking about is that what holds a group together is not just sort of their confessions. It's all of the things that they do together. The Christian Reformed Church was never just a church of confessions. It was Sabbatarianism and Olibolen and the word Banaut and not watching TV on Sunday for me, and going to Calvin College, not to state school, and going to Christian school, not to public school, and thing after thing after thing after thing made up being Christian Reformed. And the confessions were just sort of there in it and part of it, and how exactly the confessions and the Sabbatarianism, let's say, work together. Well, there are particulars about that. And part of what's sort of happened in the Christian Reformed Church is there's a group that really want to emphasize the confessions, and fairly so, but you're not going to reconstitute the Christian Reformed Church just from its confessions. There's so much more to it. And so what we saw in, for example, Synod 2023 and that clip of Rita was the tension between all of the organic CRC stuff and the confessions. That's really, in some ways, a lot of what this fight in the Christian Reformed Church has been boiling down to.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful rendering of that. Okay, well, I want to move to like the question I had for you, which after listening to your conversation with Jordan Hall, I think you made the comment, something like the household could be the seat of industry. And you were kind of talking about, I think you used the phrase, a post-industrial society.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that feels very tied into this parish thing as well. And it sounds like you're arguing for, hey, everybody, there's another way to live. That there's a way that we could restructure society, and also you don't need to wait for the government to restructure the world for you. You, as a human being, are capable of participating in a local restructuring, and it seems like you've achieved that to a degree in your own life with your family, with your community. There's a whole group of you that are, if I'm understanding your life right.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've achieved it, but it's certainly what we're aiming at. And I would say maybe over the next 50 years is that we become a village or a series of villages again. It's hard. It's countercultural. And like you said, the government's not going to do it for you. It isn't obvious even to our churches that it's something that is desirable maybe yet, but I think it's becoming so. For example, we homeschool our kids. And when you start to homeschool your kids, unless maybe you're super closed-minded about it, you discover that homeschooling your kids is like not ideal. Like it school is not ideal for all kinds of reasons. Like, you know, let's just say your generic public school, where elementary school is somewhat of a village, because usually, at least in my area, elementary schools are smaller. They are kind of in your neighborhood. You might actually know some of the teachers and there's a decent amount of accountability. But as you move up to middle school and as you move up to high school, it's like you just become this anonymous cog in the public school machine. That is definitely not desirable to me, to my kids. And yet the exact opposite of that, which is they're just stuck with me at home, is not, putting the worst spin on it. We actually really enjoy homeschooling, and I think our kids do too, but is not ideal either. The ideal to me is something like the village. It's something like, I'm not the only one who's teaching my children and looking after them, and they're not only looking after their siblings, but that there's some mixture that is right and good and growing. I mean, this is a theme throughout the Bible. Neither marriage should not be too close or too far. Like you don't marry incestuously, but you also don't just marry someone from some other tribe that worships some other god. You have to have the right amount of distance and the right amount of intimacy. And the village, I think, is that. And so that's what I'm aiming my life toward as best I can. So
now I love this part because, again, it unfolds, more aspects of life, economics. And again, I'll bring back Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, where don't put the ministers in charge of the economy. Don't put the ministers in charge of politics. Don't put the ministers in charge of any of those things. Let the ministers do their job in ministry. This revillaging. Churches, and again, some of his mainline sensibilities here, churches, you went to church in order to what? Make business contacts. Because you trusted people in the church, because they were in the same church as you. And I saw this all the time, even in the Haitian churches, if you scam someone in your own church, you don't want that trouble, because everybody's going to know about it. Just look at the story that I had with Ray, even in the cult. So the idea is a high trust environment because you know each other, because it's small. But how do you get there now? And I couldn't. I had ideas listening to this video. Some of those ideas might come out. One of the things that I thought about was, we already have the House of Woo, and they'll pray for you if you go to the House of Woo. But I thought of having basically, I'm still not sure how to implement that, but something to the effect of certain number of hours a week, I'm available. It'd be something similar to a live stream. You can click on a link and we can pray together. And we can pray together with the cameras on the open internet if you want, or we'll shut the cameras off and shut the internet connection and pray together in a different way. So because I think Ross is right. I think we need to revillage. And I think we need to revillage in an internet way. And I think that's actually what we are doing. So today I was on the House of Woo for a fair amount of time, and we were talking through some stuff, and Sam was there, and Henry was there, the new guy, and on and on and on and on. And so we have to figure out how to continue this revillaging, because there's a lot of obstacles to it, because people are living here and not there, and people have time for this and not that. And the funny thing about the internet, it's sort of filling the holes in a way that living together. I was watching some economic videos about what was the economic word? Agglomeration. Why, for example, Silicon Valley sort of develops as it does, because everyone's just living there close by. So if you need a venture capitalist, they're over there. And if you need a software engineer, they're over there. And if you need, I mean, they're all around there, because that's what they're doing there. And for a long time, the question is, what are we doing here? Well, I think we're revillaging. And then the question is going to be, now, we can't sort of build everything that a village has. We'll never get up to that resolution. And I'm not sure that we should. And I'm not sure that we should try. But I'm also not sure that we can't do more. So maybe I will have dropped that Martin Shaw clip in. Maybe I'll see if I can find some of what I preached in Germany. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.
I see that here in Germany too. So we went to a restaurant last night and they didn't take cards, and so poor Job had to find an ATM. And he said, "Oh, this is a very Catholic country. There's Marys all over the place. There's crosses all over the place. There's a lot of religion here." And there's a lot of different kinds of religion here. We noted in Job's community, they're building a significantly sized church in that place. So it is not that nobody goes to church in Europe, but all of this stuff is situated, and it's situated relationally. So then I asked I would have liked to have pursued this angle in a podcast like this. It's his job to ask me questions. It's his audience. I try not to have them click away in the first few minutes. Like I know most of you did when the algorithm first served up my video about Jordan Peterson. I know you did. Some of you admit it. I said, no. Minister? No. And somehow you watched it, and here we are. But I wanted to really press on him and say, why do you keep those buildings around? Well, and he immediately said, well, we're trying to keep them here. Well, why the urgency? Well, they used to be filled with people, the people who are motivated to expend themselves significantly to build something that looks as useless to us as a tower. And they used to pay for themselves in a sense. And yeah, there was politics involved, and there was competition involved, and all of those things were happening. But now suddenly they don't pay for themselves anymore, and they're old and expensive. And so, well, I don't know, we'll have to have the taxpayers keep the roof on these places. Well, they've certainly got tourism dollars, et cetera, et cetera. But I really wanted to lean into them and say, why do you keep the buildings? And the funny thing is, I don't know that he knows. And I don't know that we can answer that question. Well, they're pretty, they're. And it's just like that relational thing. Well, why do you come here? Well, because somehow I know that relating to this is important. It's meaningful. Now I think when I look at all of these churches, obviously people hundreds of years ago had a reason for building them because we're a great deal wealthier than they are. And so when they sacrificed to put these churches together, it probably meant they were considerably less comfortable than if they had just kept the money to themselves. I look at this even in the New World when I think about the Christian schools that the Dutch Calvinists built and the churches and all of those people that I know because they're part of my tradition. They sacrificed in order to build the church and build the school because that was really important. Why? Well, that's a complicated answer, but I almost look at these churches as, if you watch Independence Day. So one of the things I've also learned here is that all of you have seen American movies. We Americans are the conquerors. We are controlling you through McDonald's, Domino's, KFC, but especially our movies. So Independence Day. So the aliens are coming down and they're kicking our butts, but what do they hear about out in Area 51? Nobody watched Independence Day? Maybe I'm proved wrong.
I watched it.
Will Smith?
Yeah. I could have been involved.
There's a UFO in Area 51. There's an alien spacecraft. But they have a problem, right? What's their problem? They don't know how to work it. I look around Europe and I look at these churches and I almost see alien spacecrafts. Because all the people living around here, except it's not that the aliens came from somewhere else, it's that nobody or very few people here still know how to work it. And so then I think, now, this is a very complex thing, and I don't want to go too far in this because that could be a very long thing. But somehow I think that what we're doing here, that we've learned to use screens, and here I have my cute little tablet here with some notes that I've, diligently made between 1 and 2 a.m. last night because I wanted to be sure I had something, but I was also probably sure I was going to completely ignore it, most of which I have. We have all these screens. And the thing about this screen, this is not even close to the potential of any one of you for relationship and for glory. And so part of me, this is the craziest thing for someone who, in a sense, is here because of YouTube, to say that it's, again, screens are fine. I listen to YouTube. I'm not turning my screens away. I'm not getting rid of my smartphone. I'm going to keep watching YouTube, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But the connections that you guys make here, the connections that you make in your estuaries, all of those connections, I believe, are part of our culture relearning how to use the alien technology. Now, we've learned a ton of things in the last couple of 100 years. Our relational capacity to manage and to order and to control and to develop systems, we have grown immensely. But the truth is that the most powerful things around us are not running through wires or going over internets, but are sitting here in these chairs. And the kinds of relationships that you can build can become something. Again, back to Papa Peterson. You have to do something. Has to be relational. All of this started for me when I was playing around with YouTube because it was kind of a fun thing, and Freddie Schuler said, "Pastor Paul, why don't me and you make a TV show?" Okay, Freddie. Well, I'm not going to go down to public access. Let's just make a little something, put it on YouTube. So then we did that. Make a little video about Synod. I did that. Make a little video about how altars work. I did that. Nobody watched any of these things. I saw Jordan Peterson make his videos, and I thought, And I listened to the response, and I said, it looks to me like a whole group of people, the great-great-grandsons of the people that built all of that alien technology that Christians and non-Christians alike, the whole world wants to come around and gawk at here in Museum Europe. It seems to me that these people want to get back in touch with this alien technology. And what would that look like? What if they started talking to one another? What if they started relating? What if they started to knit themselves together into communities, into families, into churches? Maybe then the things could fly, and we would all learn what a tower is for, and whatever next psychotechnologies come, wedded with the old, will do, and in my opinion, where it will go. Now, at this point, I always sort of lose control of the talk. It's not for me.
Sorry.
At this point, I always lose control of the talk because I think something that our ancestors who built the alien technologies understood was that, Job said it the other day, you know, let's say you're a stonemason. You spend your whole life working on that church or that cathedral, and you die, and your son picks up the trade, and he works it too. All of these people work to build something that they themselves will not receive the fruits of. What does that mean? I think it means the same thing with all of the little touches of suchness and moreness that we have going on here. Because, again, I know this is a difficult thing for modern people to believe, and part of my desire is to help modern people believe this. But I believe that at least some, if not many or most or who knows how many, of the relationships that you build here, there'll be moreness, and there'll be more after that and more after that. Now, the thing is, John's 71 and Burns 69 or 67, and I'm 59. So our time is running out. And, you know, how many years will you get to know Paul Vanderklay? And I know some of you, oh, Paul, I want everybody to watch your videos. Yeah, then you're going to have a harder time talking to me or getting a Randos slot. So it's self-defeating. But I do believe that when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And I believe that those alien psychotechnologies that your ancestors sacrificed to build in the old world will somehow connect heaven and earth. And I don't know how it's going to go, and I don't know how it's going to happen, but I suspect it is a critical part of the story. And again, the irony is that what you all are doing here today in becoming a body of sorts, talked about that in some of my videos, I want to get into that more, becoming a body of sorts is the kind of thing that actually does this. So most of all, I want to thank you for coming. And I look forward to, we've got, you know, this evening and tomorrow, and I'll have more conversations with you all, and thank you for your gifts, and, you know, all of that is great. But what I really want for you is to build the relationships. Take the suchness, lean into the moreness, try something, do something, and see where it goes. 5 years ago, I made a video, less than 5 years ago, I made a video about Jordan Peterson having no idea where it would go. And John Van Donk and I suddenly had moreness in our relationship. And then Job contacted me, and we had moreness in our relationship. And Cassidy, tipless restaurant the woman wanted to talk to me about. I almost turned her down. I want to talk to you about a tipless restaurant. Is this a naked publicity grab? And then the next video, she says, I want to talk to you about why I don't like Jordan Peterson. Oh, that'll do wonders for the algorithm. But, all right, let's look for the moreness in the relationship. And how many of you? And here we go, and here we are. And what can't God do with this? So what he will do with it, I don't know. But what can't he do with it? So take these days, lean into that moreness, build those relationships, and then do something. Almost everything I've done in my life as a minister has failed. Who would imagine making a YouTube about a Canadian psychologist would do something like this? You're young, most of you. Fail plenty. Talk to John Van Donk about how many jobs he's had. The failure that he was and how many jobs. Somebody asked me, well, John isn't a pastor right now. Can you clarify that? John says, no, let's not. Lean into the moreness, do something, and believe. Now, I know some of you are a little vague on the God thing, but I'm a pastor, so you expect to hear it. Believe that God can do more than you can possibly ask or imagine. There's my talk.
Thanks, Paul.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. A ghost with a Messiah complex. A Messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us. Baptized in ball pits. A clown served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers, see what I say, just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried in a fading dream.
I don't know about the meaning crisis, left, right, black, white, or other vices, which Jesus Christ is right, or if we're all saved. From my perspective, our propositions participate procedurally, running in circles, remembering body, we're in the age of decay. Symbolically speaking, the reapers are reaping, them damn egregores are whispering sweetly. We're all NPCs in the belly of the beast. Red pill, blue pill, bread pill, Mars Hill, or DMT, or whatever you feel. Got one and number two, it's all the same damn thing. So clean your room, repent on Zoom, ontology for dummies, a bird's eye view. 'Cause if you really knew, could you really even say? Totally depraved, all totally saved, a total disposition from the bed we all made. Or is it the elect, or are we just insane? From John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson to the Chris Pacou Show, Paul Vanderclays and Griswold Grimm and all the dice he shakes. This estuary ditty is a little bit cringy, ain't quite the U-shaped or the hero's journey. All the NPCs in the flood treading water to watch you save the day with a bunch of chitter-chatter. From the ortho bros to the Catholic Joes, or atheistic Jobs, to Protestant folks, the Joe Schmoes and Jewish Jacobs, and everything in between. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th, in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderclay, Rod Dreer, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.